Welcome back for the first session of the day. On behalf of Namita Gokhale, William Dalrymple, Sanjoy Roy, and my colleagues at Asia Society and Teamwork Arts, we welcome you to this session of JLF New York Virtual Festival. Shadow State, Murder, Mayhem, and Russia's Remaking of the West. Luke Harding in conversation with Suhasini Haidar. In an era of kleptocratic governments and modernization of communist era, propaganda for the age of Facebook and Twitter, Luke Harding's The Shadow State explores the alleged hidden war orchestrated by Russia to reshape the modern world. Detailing accounts of espionage, corruption, and KGB-style murders, the book takes us through the murky waters of how deep the Russian roots run in the post-Soviet world. In a conversation with Suhasini Haidar, Harding discusses this threat to America and the future of Western democracy. Luke Harding. Luke is a Guardian foreign correspondent. Between 2007 and 2011, he was the Guardian's Moscow bureau chief. The Kremlin expelled him from the country in the first case of its kind since the Cold War. He is the author of Collusion, a New York Times #1 bestseller, A Very Expensive Poison, The Snowden Files and Mafia State, as well as the co-author of WikiLeaks and The Liar, which was nominated for the Orwell Prize. In conversation with Suhasini Haidar. Suhasini is the diplomatic and national editor at The Hindu. She writes regularly on India's foreign policy, has contributed to several books on the subject, and is a public speaker on international affairs and journalism. We're delighted to have Lonchura as the podcast partner for this session. This conversation will be followed by a Q&A, so please feel free to send in your questions by typing in the question box on your screens. All our sessions will later be available to view on our Facebook page and YouTube channel. Do follow our pages at JLF LitFest across Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook to be notified of the upcoming sessions. Stay tuned to the jlflitfest.org/New York for the full schedule and information about our speakers. In these unusually difficult times, we have struggled to bring you JLF New York without charging a registration fee. Please donate as generously as you can to ensure a free, seamless, and continuous flow of knowledge. You can donate to us on our website, jlflitfest.org/New York, by clicking and donating on the Support Us tab. Ladies and gentlemen, now presenting Shadow State, Murder, Mayhem, and Russia's Remaking of the West. Suhasini, over to you.
Thanks so much, Suraj, and it really is a pleasure to be here. Good evening in Delhi and good morning in New York and across the world. Welcome to this very special discussion with Luke Harding. Luke, I do want to ask you about Shadow State in particular and what made you write this book. But when you look at the list, and Suraj was putting that list out, the books are called Collusion, Secret Meetings, Dirty Money, and How Russia Helped Donald Trump Win. Then there's a Very Expensive Poison, the assassination of Litvinenko and Russia's war with the West, the Snowden Files, and Mafia State, how one reporter became the enemy of the Russian state. Given that Shadow State picks up from where all these books leave off, I have to ask, is it now quite personal? Is it part of a mission, if you like, for you? What made you write this?
Well, thank you, Suhasini, and hello, everybody. Good evening, good afternoon in London, where I am. Good morning in NYC. I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I think two things. First of all, I've always written non-fiction books, and actually, given how dark and twisting and improbable and often ridiculous our era is, you wonder why you would ever be a novelist. Because I've always believed the best stories are true stories, and they just keep coming. I mean, they keep rolling, whether it's the Snowden Files, as you mentioned, or a Russian dissident being poisoned by 2 Kremlin assassins in 2006 with a radioactive cup of tea. That was Alexander Litvinenko, or allegations that the President of the United States is somehow beholden to Russia and Vladimir Putin, and that the Kremlin helped him win back in 2016. And it's not that I'm some kind of obsessive, Suhasini. It's merely that the story kept going, and I think after Collusion, where I tried to kind of lay out the mesh of relationships between the Trump campaign and Russia and the role of Russian intelligence operatives and oligarchs and other intermediaries, various things happened. two in particular, which I write about in Shadow State. One was another crazy, theatrical, gruesome murder or attempted murder, which was of Sergei Skripal, a former intelligence officer with the GRU, with Russian military intelligence, who you'll remember was poisoned with Novichok in Salisbury in the spring of 2018, like a kind of rehash of the Litvinenko story. And the other thing that happened
it was on the door handles.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't a teapot this time, or a posh hotel in central London, not far from the Indian Embassy or the Indian High Commission. It was a door handle of a suburban home in a quiet little cul-de-sac in a cathedral city where nothing ever happens or happened. And it was the sort of thuggishness of it, the brazen nature of this crime, where you simply send two killers on a plane, they breeze through passport control. It's the beginning of my book, Shadow State, with fake passports. I mean, they're real passports, but the names are fake. So they're working under kind of Cold War cover, Cold War tradecraft. And then these guys from Siberia get a train to Salisbury for a reconnaissance day. They subsequently say they turned back because there was snow. They encountered snow, which is ludicrous. And then the next day they come back and they poison their target, who survives only just. So there was this kind of neo-Cold War moment. And the other thing which I think compelled me to write Shadow State was the behavior of Donald Trump when he met with Vladimir Putin in Helsinki for a bilateral summit a couple of years ago, where he was asked point blank whether he would condemn Russian interference, espionage, hacking to help him. And he said, well, Vladimir has given me some very strong assurances, and essentially sided with the Russian president, no friend of America's, over the unanimous advice of his own intelligence agencies. It was an astonishing moment. And that was when I picked up my pen again, or I guess picked up my laptop, because we all write on laptops these days, don't we?
Interesting, and I do want to come to that relationship between Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump. And I should add for our viewers that, of course, the story that Russia put out about these two gentlemen who were found on tape in Salisbury was that they were two Russian businessmen who had gone to look at the cathedral there. But you know, and we will come back.
So Hasni, they were beguiled by the 1,000-meter spire and an ancient cult. They'd flown all the way from provincial Russia to see a tower.
So we will come back to this Novichok story, but I do want to ask, because you pointed to the fact that Mr. Trump did not really take on Russia. In fact, in his 4 years in office, we didn't actually hear him take on Russia even once, or clearly say anything about Russia directly. It was always a segue to criticizing one of his other political rivals. Everything that you have unearthed, and obviously we don't have enough time to really go through all the details of the evidence that you've put together in your book, but everything you've unearthed and written about is part of dossiers somewhere. Dossiers in Washington, dossiers in the UK, dossiers in presumably several Western capitals. There was a Mueller report in the United States which found some damning evidence about Russian interference. In July this year, the British government put out its own report, basically finding that they hadn't done enough to investigate Russian interference. You, in your book, have written about the idea that when Mr. Trump speaks to Mr. Putin, just shortly after what happened in Salisbury Plain, the suspected poisoning of a former Russian agent who lived in the UK. I think it resulted in the death of one sort of innocent person as well. And you said this was an attack on an ally, and yet the US did nothing. So my question is, was the evidence really enough? Was it clinching? Why is it the world is not more consumed about Russia's actions here?
Well, I'm not sure I quite agree with the premise of the question. I mean, I think certainly in Washington, the story of collusion, if you like, has really been the dominant political scandal of the Trump era. And the curious thing is we still don't have all of the answers. I mean, Mueller never looked at Trump's money. He never looked at whether Russian state entities or banks had actually lent him money indirectly via Deutsche Bank. We don't quite know. There are a slew of legal cases, which I think will come down the road as soon as Trump leaves office and loses immunity. So, I mean, I think the evidence was pretty overwhelming. That you mentioned Mueller, which to my mind was an historic miss. I think it was rather disappointing. I think Mueller was excessively cautious, never interviewed Trump, didn't pursue his money, didn't interview Russian witnesses. But we also had a equally important document, not as much noticed, in August. The Senate Intelligence Committee in Washington, which is run by the Republicans, produced its own counterintelligence findings, and they were pretty damning. And for example, they identified someone called Konstantin Kilimnik, whom I write about in Shadow State as a career Russian intelligence officer. He was meeting with Paul Manafort throughout 2016, receiving confidential polling data from the Trump campaign. And meanwhile, we had the Russian troll factory in St. Petersburg impersonating Americans and doing a massive social media operation to play with people's heads, actually. So, I mean, I think the interference was tangible. I mean, what historians will decide is whether it pushed Trump across the line. My view and Hillary Clinton's view is it did. In 2020, they were less active for reasons we can discuss. But I mean, just one last thing is that I think we have to be clear that Vladimir Putin is not some super genius villain sitting in a cave surrounded by flashing consoles, pressing buttons, making things happen in Mumbai or Islamabad or London or Paris or wherever. He is a kind of classic KGB opportunist who tries things and see whether they work out. And he's been trying to influence Western politics through different vectors. It used to be the Communist Party. 40 years ago, Russia had a huge espionage operation in India, by the way. And now it's the sort of far right. It's the nationalist, populist, xenophobic far right. It's Trump, it's Marine Le Pen. To some degree, it's Brexit and Boris Johnson. It doesn't always work out, but he tries. So he doesn't originate all our problems. He doesn't cause them, but he tries to use and instrumentalize them for his own sovereign purposes.
Yeah, and a running theme in your books, just in case anyone thinks we're being libelous or defamatory here, a running theme in your books has been that the actual aim of Mr. Putin and the Kremlin under Putin is really to derail, in a sense, Western democracy. Why is that?
Well, it's a Soviet aim. I mean, these are long-held strategic goals which the KGB had throughout the Cold War. There was a term for it, active measures. And the idea actually is Leninist, although, Lenin is gone, but the idea persists. And that is that Russia is in a state of permanent, unofficial, semi-war with the Western world. I mean, it used to be with capitalism, but now it's with America is the main enemy, the Glavny Protivnik in Russia. The UK is a junior enemy tied to the United States. And once you understand that mentality, it becomes easier to comprehend why Russia would send killers to London or to Salisbury or to Berlin or to Istanbul to snuff out, to exterminate enemies. I mean, that's a kind of martial act. It's a shocking act, and yet it keeps on happening, and it keeps on happening because Putin sees himself in a state of permanent adversarialism with Washington and so on.
And I think,
yeah,
go ahead. That it's a permanent state of siege, in a sense of grievance, that greatness has been taken away from.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that Putin is on this sort of revenge mission or grudge-driven mission, if you like, to recover from what he regards as the humiliation of the Soviet collapse of the 1990s and the Boris Yeltsin, and he wants Russia to be a co-equal. I mean, this is your world. You're the diplomatic editor of The Hindu, but a sort of co-equal to the United States and an indispensable player in world affairs. So if it's Kashmir or Ukraine or Iran and the nuclear program, Moscow wants to be consulted and respected. But while we've got that kind of showy nationalist, hyper-nationalist, revisionist project thing going on, there's also another thing which the Putin elite are very keen on, and that's stealing money. That they've become billionaires over the past 2 decades. That they're the richest people probably who've ever walked the earth. And actually, what really keeps them awake at night is safeguarding their billions, defending it from predatory attack by other people inside the Russian regime, and ensuring that they retire and that their kids can inherit all that stuff.
Sure, but I mean, Russia would not be the only country that has that. So let's talk a little bit about what makes this entire situation really unique. And I think you put your finger on it when you spoke about that meeting between Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump. There weren't too many conversations between the two men during the last 4 years, but even so, I mean, publicly known ones. In your book, you make the case not only that Mr. Trump benefited from Russia's attempts to derail the US election and in whatever form that they were successful, but you almost indicate he seems to be under pressure from Russia. There's one bit where you talk about Mr. Trump, coming back from Helsinki, and before I get to that, maybe we should have you read a little bit about just how that meeting went, because I think that's, that, as you said, that was the moment that made you write this book. So if you'd like to read a little bit from that. Okay, so I'll just quickly. So Trump has backed Putin, and he goes, so Trump's abject performance in Helsinki prompted dismay at home, not just from the president's usual naysayers, but also from his loyal friends. On the way back to Washington, aboard Air Force One, Trump's mood grew foul as he became of the torrent of criticism directed at him. The question of collusion was eclipsed, at least for a bit, by an even graver accusation that Trump had betrayed America and Americans. His obeisance to Putin had been on show before, but in Helsinki, even those inclined to give Trump the benefit of the doubt had to admit that his behavior was so craven and spineless, it was hard not to be suspicious. Even media outlets favorable to the president were unimpressed. The Wall Street Journal said it was a national embarrassment. The New York Daily Times ran the headline, "Open Treason." Beneath was a cartoon of Trump shooting Uncle Sam in the head on Fifth Avenue while holding the hand of a topless Putin. The idea that Trump was treason-like, or treasony, or treasonish, or a treason weasel seeped into popular culture, gifting comedians and late-night hosts some easy gags. 48 hours later, and back in the White House, Trump rode back on his remarks from Helsinki, sort of. Reading from a prepared script, he claimed at the crucial moment he misspoke. Trump delivered this mini-speech with the sincerity of a hostage victim forced by his kidnappers at gunpoint to read a list of demands in front of a wobbly camera. The stubbly guy with the Kalashnikov just out of shot. It was clear that he didn't really mean what he said. As soon as the statement was finished, Trump reverted to his previous ambiguous superposition in which the question of Russia's culpability was vague and cosmically unknowable. He didn't make it any more well-known, but I was struck by the bit where you said that he spoke with the sincerity of a hostage at gunpoint. Was this about Mr. Trump's business deals, his desire to have a Trump tower in Moscow? Was it about his attempts to find information on President Obama and the famous, for want of a better way to describe it, but the golden showers atop the hotel bed that Mr. Trump supposedly took part in? Was this about incriminating evidence, or what you refer to as compromat through the book, on Mr. Trump?
Well, I mean, I think we can't know, of course, but I think the amount of compromat that the Kremlin has on Donald Trump would comfortably fill your study, Suhasini, and probably the rest of your house if you have a house. I mean, it would certainly it would take an enormous amount of space. And what you have to understand is that Trump has been visiting Moscow for 35 years. He made his first trip in the late 1980s. invited by the KGB, by interest. He would have been spied upon there, bugged. There would have been a psychological assessment of him. And we know from that period that the KGB were very keen to recruit Americans, and were looking for people with sort of upwardly mobile, people with character flaws, like narcissism, people who are corruptible, who are unfaithful in their marriage, lousy analysts. And he looked through this KGB checklist from leaked documents, and Trump is off the scale. And he keeps going back. There's the famous trip in 2013 for the Miss Universe Beauty Contest, where allegedly he's filmed in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. What I can tell you from my 4 years in Moscow, when I was the Guardian's correspondent there, is that we had a series of spooky, mysterious break-ins into our apartments, and we were advised by the British Embassy this was the FSB spy agency, successor to the KGB, once run by Vladimir Putin, and that we were bugged. We had bugs in our bedroom, including video. On one occasion, the FSB broke in and left behind a sex manual as a kind of bizarre gift, which I had to explain to my wife. You know, it's not mine. It's these guys. And the serious point is that, you know, if they would bother to harass me and film me or record me, then of course they would do it for any VIP visitor to Moscow, whether it's the Indian foreign minister, whether it's Donald Trump, President Obama, or whoever. So there'll be all of that stuff, which I'll have. And separately, the big mystery of the 21st century are financial connections between the Trump organization and Russia. I mean, we know on the campaign trail back in 2015, 2016, he was trying to do a deal, build a hotel in Moscow costing $1 billion. And I suspect that once Joe Biden becomes president in January, that more will come out. And I really think Donald Trump's travails are only just beginning.
Well, it's worth watching. But perhaps what interests the world quite a lot, and particularly democracies, is just how you believe Russia was able to subvert democracies, whether it was the hackers, the WikiLeaks, the use of the media, the role of Russian state television or state-affiliated television. Tell us a bit about that. Is it? I mean, the UK report actually found that there was no successful subversion of elections, and certainly not of Brexit. But how do you think it works?
Well, I mean, just firstly on that's what the UK government says. But what the Russia report says by an independent committee of MPs, including from the ruling party, British MPs, is that the government didn't actually ask the question whether there'd been any interference or not. So successful interference is one of those kind of meaningless non-statements. And what my book sketches out, I have a chapter on this called Moscow Gold, is a parallel operation to support Brexit, which ran at the same time as the operation to support Donald Trump in 2016. These kind of twin shocks to Western democracy. And often involving the same people. I mean, the two dramas overlapped. And what I find dismaying, talking to you from London, is that in the US, at least, there's been a semi-attempt to reckon with all this. There's been Mueller, there's been a Senate commission that spent 3 years looking at it. In this country, we have nothing, because Boris Johnson believes in Brexit, and Vladimir Putin loves it because he sees the European Union as a strategic rival and adversary, and he wants to do everything he can to destroy the EU and to diminish the UK militarily, economically, politically, and so on. So, you know, Brexit's been a huge success for him. And this interference game, it's not new. It's been happening forever. But I think the difference, Suhasini, is that it's being done now on a huge scale, because, you know, there's politics, is sort of soft underbelly of our world. I mean, 30 years ago, Russian spies were trying to get military secrets. Now they're trying to influence our politics. But it's not just a story of bad Russians doing things from far away. It's also a story of our own corruption, of the porousness of our societies, and the fact that we let ourselves be influenced by unscrupulous, shadowy forces, whether they're foreign states or other bad actors. And I think democracy is in a more precarious position than it has been, well, for all of our adult lives, I would say.
Okay, well, one of the reviews of your book also had, really drawn this very, very dire picture of Russia, referring to it as Mordor, referring to Putin as Sauron. from, of course, The Lord of the Rings. And I do have to ask, is there a double standard here? You know, the UK and France colonized the world. I mean, they went in and decapitated countries, took away their resources. The US, according to that Carnegie Mellon University studied, subverted elections as many as 81 times between 1946 and 2000, and that doesn't include military coups and regime changes of other kinds. Why should the world, be particularly worried about Russia subverting elections in these very countries that have carried out some form of regime intervention at various points of time?
Yeah, I mean, it's a perfectly decent and valid question, but the thing is, it's possible for something to be wrong and something else to also be wrong. In other words, we don't post-rationalize American or British malfeasance, both now and in the past, whether it's the Iraq War or the elections you talk about where the CIA interfered. I mean, clearly that's wrong. I mean, that's absolutely wrong. But at the same time, you know, there are certain people on the left, and I count myself as someone who's progressive on the progressive side of the political spectrum, who are only focused on the kind of American imperialism, if you like. But there's clearly Russian imperialism as well. I mean, you just have to look at Crimea or look at the fact that Europe's borders have been changed by force for the first time since 1945 to see that there are all other people doing kind of revisionist stuff too. So I think we have to be careful of false equivalence, because this is a particular sort of Kremlin trope, and it's got a name, and that name is whataboutism. Whataboutism. So as soon as you say, well, Russia, this opposition leader, Alexei Navalny, has been poisoned with Novichok in Siberia by the FSB, which is what Western governments believe. And then someone goes, well, what about the Iraq War? Or what about
Halabja?
Yemen,
right.
You know, Halabja, etc. And that doesn't work, because that's a kind of race to the bottom. And pretty quickly, the world becomes a sort of nihilistic playground, which is what Putin wants, where there's no international law, there are no principles, there are no human rights. It's just great powers overruling smaller powers. And I think that's bad for everybody. And so I'm kind of pro-truth. I'm pro-human rights. And I'm sort of pro-transparency. I just think as citizens, wherever we are, whether we're sitting in Ahmedabad or whether we're sitting in Surrey or in Chicago, that we want decent, accountable government. And we also want to be able to kick politicians out through fair, proper elections when the moment comes.
All right. And of course, you mentioned Crimea, and you've spent time in India, and I think you were probably here around that time as well. The Indian reaction to the Crimean crisis was essentially to say, we hope this conflict is resolved and not take any sides. And there was a certain frustration in both Washington and London that India did not take sides there. Its reaction to Novichok and the fact that two people had been attacked in this very, very purposeful way. I should read to you what the Ministry of External Affairs said, and I want to know how you felt about India's reaction. Was that, of course, India is against the use of chemical weapons anywhere, at any time, by anybody, under any circumstances. That was actually the Indian reaction. They went on to say, we hope this issue is resolved in accordance with the provisions of the Chemical Weapons Convention so as to reach evidence-based conclusions. In other words, that entire story that you have so vividly written about in Shadow State, and I think so many you have written about it before as well, essentially boiled down to India saying, well, we hope there are some evidence-based conclusions, and of course, chemical weapons should not be used, but that has been the Indian position. How do you see that?
Well, I mean, far, you know, be it for me to criticize the Indian government. I mean, just to preface this by saying that I lived in India for 3.5 years. I'm a huge fan of India. I was there as a student, there as a correspondent for The Guardian, and our second kid was born in New Delhi. So I think could theoretically become an Indian citizen. But having said all that, I think these comments are underwhelming and really missing the point. I mean, any state, whether it's Russia or whoever, really can't go around sending assassins all over the place to kill people they don't like, traitors. I mean, that's just not acceptable in the 21st century. And of course, it's extremely dangerous. And in this case, it was an innocent woman actually who died, who had nothing to do with this, picked up the poison Novichok by chance and sprayed it on her wrists and died a horrific death 48 hours later. And so what we do need, whether it's India or anyone else, I think is we do need solidarity. We do need governments to reaffirm their commitment to international law and to human rights, and to behave accordingly when people sort of break that. And what I slightly worry about is a kind of a network of populist, nationalist governments who see their kind of political priorities as the only ones, and who can go in quite an authoritarian direction. And that's not a critique of India or the BJP or Mr. Modi. I think it's generally applicable, including to my country. And like I said, I think democracy is in a bit of a parlous condition, and what we need as citizens, as readers, as book lovers, as civilized people is a fight back, a kind of enlightenment-driven contestation of some of the bad ideas out there which are swirling around.
Right. I mean, you make a powerful case over there. And of course, as you said, there is this network, if you like, of alpha men that we are seeing when Mr. Putin will have outlived so many. And as of now, he is able to be president, I think, until what, 2035?
Forever. Seriously, forever.
For the rest of our lives. But there is this rise of alpha men, the populist, strong men around the world, and so many have written about that. There was, as you said, we talk about the retrenchment of the United States, but it is also Mr. Trump refusing to take on Russia. There is a case being made now that, in fact, Mr. Trump's era, far from actually being tough on China, allowed China the space to say these things. Essentially, and then we have, the idea that Russia has an agenda that it is able to carry out over there. But I still do want to ask you, because you've covered some of these others, you've covered Libya as well. Is there a danger there then of vilifying a country and then being left with the idea that even when you peel away these layers and you take away what you think of as the bad guys in this equation, whether it's been, any of the other countries with external interventions, Iraq, and even the attempts in Syria, that you actually leave behind much more trouble for the world?
Well, that's a question about intervention and foreign wars, and whether it's possible to do a kind of humanitarian liberal intervention, as we saw in the 90s in the Balkans, for example, and former Yugoslavia, a strategy pursued by Bill Clinton and Tony Blair back then, or whether, I think after Iraq and also Libya, which is kind of unfolding disaster, that principle has more or less fallen away. And meanwhile, we've had Syria. We've had this disastrous, horrendous war in Syria where hundreds of thousands of people have been killed, where actually Western countries haven't intervened. Actually, Russia has intervened, really rescued Assad about 4 years ago, the first time that Russia had deployed outside the former borders of the USSR since Cold War times. So intervention is tricky and problematic, but just to stress, again, it's not about diminishing countries or spoiling relations. And we have to acknowledge that Russia is a great country of 140 million people, and you have to decouple those great people, many of them my friends, from the particular clique of billionaire KGB officers who are running the state essentially for their own purposes. That's what a shadow state is. It's when any group hijacks a state and uses the bureaucracy, uses the instruments of power for personal gain and political advantage. And
at one point, you call it the East India Company, because essentially you're making the case that it wasn't it was a state you were getting, not just a group.
Yeah, and it comes in many guises. I mean, it can be sort of in the piratical guise of a corporation or a big company, where actually there's a state behind it. But ultimately it's about, as I said, about our corruption. I mean, London, my town has become Londongrad. It's awash with dirty money from Eastern Europe. There are British lawyers, estate agents, private school headmasters who've grown rich on this money. And this kind of kleptocratic stream is bad for us. It's bad for our politics. And that's actually why I write this book, not to stigmatize anybody or any country, but to sort of explain in our era of offshore, of transnational money laundering, of a very kind of buyable elite that we just need to be kind of vigilant and hold firm to our sort of citizen values, if you like.
Okay. I can see we're getting a lot of questions in, Luke, so I'm going to take some of those with you. Maruta Kalnins asked, if you were Biden, how would you deal with Putin? And I'll just tag on another question, which is from Alex, who asked, how would you compare the situation around the US 2016 elections with 2020?
Thanks, Maruta. Thanks, Alex. Really good questions. Just briefly on Biden, I mean, Biden clearly will have far chillier relations with Vladimir Putin than Donald Trump. That goes without saying. I think in foreign policy terms, it'll be a restorationist presidency, quite similar to the Obama era. And I suspect we will end up in a place, or I hope we'll end up in a place of containment or neo-containment. This is George Kennan, who wrote the famous long telegram at the beginning of the Cold War, where basically Obama tried to reset relations with Putin, but Putin's not interested in mutual solutions. He's a zero-sum guy. What's good for Russia is what's bad for America, and vice versa. So I think it'll be making clear to Russia that if they do this kind of malign stuff, there will be, bad consequences, whether it's further sanctions or so on. And in terms of 2016 versus 2020, Russia more or less sat out 2020, with the exception of this whole Ukraine imbroglio, which saw Trump being impeached at the beginning of this year, where there was quite a big disinformation push. And I think, in a way, that's because Trump has been the dream candidate for the sort of KGB regime in Delhi. I mean, he has done things that the Soviet Union dreamed of years ago, estranging America from its transatlantic partners, right, offending the Germans, reducing NATO, retreating from the world, and also furthering kind of turmoil within America, which leaves the country divided and unhappy, so that Russia can do its sovereign thing elsewhere.
Right. Well, interesting. And we're getting a lot of questions, and I guess they're from the US. Meg Klein asking, given their extensive ties to the Kremlin, how much of a threat are people like Paul Manafort, Donald Trump, Steve Bannon, Stone, etc., going to be to the United States going forward, now that they're out of power and actually probably freer to do a lot more?
Yeah, thanks, Meg. I mean, it's a good question. Part of me thinks, I never really want to hear these names again. I would just be very nice to have a break. And the most alluring part of the Biden presidency is just the prospect of a bit of calm and decency, and really not turning on the news and kind of rolling around and throwing your arms in the air. But I guess the serious answer is that these people are not going away. Trump is not going away. You have to acknowledge that about 73 million people voted for him. Despite his legal problems, he will pretty much command the Republican Party, at least for a while, I think. And you have a serious part of the American population who believe the election was stolen from him. And all of those actors that Meg mentions, I think, will fuel that narrative of robbery, of fakery, and do everything they can to kneecap the Biden presidency from the beginning. So I'd like to say it's happy times ahead, but it isn't. Let's just say it's slightly better times ahead.
Okay, I think you've answered Ron's question. He asked about the future of US-Russia ties given their past as well. But he also raises the question of China. So I do have to ask you, in our part of the world, everyone is looking at the threat of China. And in India, particularly, given the aggressions we've seen at the line of actual control this summer, as well as in other parts. So I have to ask you, which do you think is a greater threat, if you like, at present? Both have actually benefited from the current state in the world.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's a sort of unbeauty contest, if you like, and I'm not sure I have a definitive answer. I mean, I think you're right. I think what's interesting is that China has gone from being a status quo power that was projecting its might through economic means, whether it's in Africa or Central Asia or Latin America, to being an out and out revisionist power that seemingly wants to change borders by force, and that's quite a scary prospect. Russia the same. I mean, annexation of Crimea, we've talked about. You would think that would be it, but I also covered the war in Georgia, the former Soviet Republic, in 2008, which saw territorial changes, and you have to wonder whether something may happen in the Baltics. So I think it's dangerous times going forward. I mean, what Russia is very good at, what it's mastered in a way that China perhaps hasn't, is playing psychological influence games, using Twitter and Facebook and the English language to try and bamboozle and troll people in English language space. So there are different nuances, but it's quite a prospect. I mean, it's a headache really going forward for New Delhi, for London, for Paris, for Washington.
Okay, we're in the last few minutes, so I'm going to take another round, perhaps the last one. Seema Sagar wants to know, in the past, your books have been available globally. The first 3 are still on Amazon. Any plans to be able to make this book available to the international audience? Is it not online yet?
Well, I must find out what's happening in India, but I mean, it was published in UK and Commonwealth countries by Faber and Faber in the summer. So I mean, it really should be available in India. I'll check that out. It was published by HarperCollins in the United States, and it's an ebook as well. So if the post is unreliable, you can get it on your Kindle. You should be able to do that. If you can't, you're welcome to email me. I'm easy to find.
And then Meg has a question, which I think we would like to end this one with. I was just reading the New York Times has advertised for its top job in Moscow, and put into perspective, how tough this job is going to be. Given your experience, would you tell young journalists, Moscow, the Moscow beat used to be like, perhaps the biggest foreign correspondent at one time. Would you recommend it? And Meg has asked you to talk about your favorite story about living in Russia as a counterweight to all the Kremlin intrigue. And of course, your previous book has many great stories, but tell us, what is your favorite?
Okay, well, firstly, on Moscow, I would say yes, definitely. It's a brilliant city. I mean, it was the most intellectually important period of my life as a foreign correspondent. I mean, which is not to diminish my time in South Asia, which I love, but it was great. I was writing about dark Kremlin politics. My wife wrote about travel and culture, and so at the weekends we would go and see Tolstoy's estate, or we'd go around Golden Ring cities and see churches covered in falling snow and so on. I mean, there's very much to like, but you do need to speak Russian. I mean, you'd have to learn Russian. I had a Russian lesson yesterday. My Russian's pretty fluent, but I'm still learning it. And Russian literature is one of the great highlights of my life. In terms of stories that, cultural stories, I mean, it's the culture that I enjoyed writing about. I wrote a piece for The Guardian at the anniversary of Tolstoy's death and why it wasn't being kind of properly celebrated in Russia. And I went around to school and talked to a bunch of teenagers about war and peace, and whether it was true the girls liked the romance, the boys liked the war, and I got various answers, and it was a glorious story to write. And as I said, it's important to remember that this is a fabulous country with wonderful people, wonderful literature, wonderful music, theatre, art, and so on. And I hope at some point Russia will be a little bit more democratic, still authentically Russian. And for the moment, I'm banned, but I hope to go back there, possibly on my Zimmer frame, and have a look around at some point in the post-Putin future.
And maybe we'll get yet another book. Certainly, I mean, for all the readers, if you're looking for something that's a thriller as well as a commentary on today's geopolitics, and you're not worried about being made to feel afraid, very afraid, then the book is Shadow State. The author is Luke Harding. It's been a pleasure. Luke, thanks so much for joining us, and I'll turn it over to our organizers at the Jaipur Lit Fest.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Suhasini. Thank you, Luke, for this really interesting conversation. I think we could have listened to you both forever, but because of the dearth of time, unfortunately, we had to stop here. We're hoping that we'll be able to resume this conversation some other time. So thank you so much for joining us today and being part of JLF New York. And thank you all for watching and being a great audience. We encourage you to buy the books of our speakers that are available through our bookstore, Full Circle. Once again, we'd like to thank all our partners for their support. We hope you all enjoyed this conversation and will tune in for our next session, Instamatic, American Masala, Sweet Saran in conversation with Yogi Suri, which is at 10:15 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, 9:15 Central Standard Time, 7:15 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, and 8:45 p.m. Indian Standard Time. Thank you once again. And now we present a reading by Kunal Agarwal from the Jaipur Writers Short Series. Enjoy.
Hi everyone, this is Kunal here. Today I am going to read one of my short writings titled Abyss. So here it goes. In this crowd of people, I have lost myself somewhere. When I looked in the mirror, I found someone else standing. When I searched, I found no traces of my being. How did I end up like this? I wondered, but found no answer. How long can I keep going like this? I questioned. Still found no answer. I have been living like it is a presentation. That doesn't impress myself. What if I die tomorrow? Will I be happy with what I achieved or regret not living fully? I wondered. There was a voice inside trying to say something to me, but alas, I have long forgotten how to hear it. Now I am in this abyss, waiting for someone to pull me up. Abyss has started staring back.
I would call the Jaipur Literature Festival a living library, or perhaps even a library of life. Do join us as we share the excitement of ideas and of debate and dialogue, of the adventures of science, of the joys of poetry and music, the consolations of philosophy, the sense of literature and of life.
So much about the festival in India, the scale of it, the energy of it, and I just love the fact that there is this effort to bring it to other cities in the world.
It's a variety of topics. It's meaningful. I'm just excited. I'm feeling like I've learned a lot to think about, and I appreciate JLF coming here.
Going forward, it would be a very good thing to do for the community to have this event on an annual basis.
think that when you hear so many different voices and perspectives about the South Asian diaspora and many other issues, you learn that there's a lot of history that you're not taught every day, and I think that that's important to bring in today's world.
I was actually really surprised by the camaraderie I experienced here and the way that people at JLF, both attendees and other panelists, seem to really connect profoundly to literature and care about it.
In 2020, our live version of JLF has been laid to waste because of COVID-19. However, nothing's going to stop us from coming in the way of bringing our writers and speakers to you in Boulder, Colorado, Houston, New York, and Toronto, Canada.
Teamwork Arts, bringing India to the world and the world to India through Indian art and culture for over 30 years. One of Teamwork Arts' signature events, the Z Jaipur Literature Festival, is the world's largest free festival of its kind. With daily interactive sessions, lively debate and dialogue, and international music performances every night, it's no wonder the festival attracts over 500,000 visitors a year. The Jaipur Bookmark, an international B2B event for the publishing industry, happens during the Z Jaipur Literature Festival and sees a confluence of publishers, writers, and literary agents Teamwork Arts, producers of the Z Jaipur Literature Festival, have taken the flavor of the festival to international shores with vibrant events in the UK, Australia and the US. Teamwork Arts takes India's artistic diversity to the world with almost 12 festivals of India across continents in a stunning array in over 40 cities. A feast for the senses, these are spectacles of dance, music, cinema, theatre, literature and so much more. In each of these places, Teamwork Arts' colourful festivals of India are the high points of the annual cultural calendars. Be it Confluence in Australia, India by the Bay in Hong Kong, India by the Nile in Egypt, Iron India in Chicago, Shared History in South Africa, India in the Sunshine City in Zimbabwe, Edinburgh Fringe Festival, Kala Utsavam in Singapore, Sarang in South Korea, festivals in Abu Dhabi, Shanghai, Sweden. The list is dizzying. The Jazz India circuit is an endeavour by Teamwork Arts to spread the word and sound of jazz across the country. The 2017-18 season, 4 festivals across 3 cities featuring over 25 stellar artists from India and around the world, including Jojo Mayer and Nerve, drummer-singer Jameson Ross and Dave Weckl, who collaborated with the talented Mohini Day. The Mahindra KABIRA festival celebrates the spirit, lyric and verse of the 15th century mystic poet Kabir in his birthplace, the historic city of Varanasi. Kabir's poetry is about inclusiveness. Mahindra KABIRA brings to music lovers an unforgettable experience of listening to leading exponents of the classical Banaras Gharana and rich folk traditions of music on the legendary banks of the mighty river Ganges, along with sessions on art and literature, specially curated walks with famous local residents and delectable local cuisine. Sacred celebrates the spiritual through music and its ability to heal. International artists collaborate with world music exponents from India amongst the most incredible desert settings on the banks of the Pushkar Lake. Heritage walks, meditation, talks and workshops are part of this weekend experience. Teamwork Arts so promotes and recognizes the best of Indian theatre through the Mahindra Excellence in Theatre Awards. The Meta Week in Delhi is an enthralling showcase of the 10 best nominated plays shortlisted from numerous entries received from across the country and across languages. The Meta Lifetime Achievement Award has been presented to leading lights of India's theatre industry. For the young and the young at heart, the Ishara International Puppet Theatre Festival brings local and international performances to audiences across several Indian cities. While the Multi-City Kahani Festival features interactive storytelling sessions and workshops championing the power of imagination. Bollywood Love Story, a musical. Our international touring productions such as Bollywood Extravaganza and Flamenco India have sold out shows across Europe, Egypt, Russia and Spain. Expressions International Contemporary Dance Festival showcases Indian and international productions, bringing together several dance genres for Indian audiences. Teamwork Arts, celebrating the arts. For more information, visit www.teamworkarts.com